All right, so we've got some really cool stuff coming on this call. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and it'll take a minute for people to dial in. So my screen share will just be up here for a minute. I'll just leave the antitrust policy notice up. We normally have that for about 2 minutes. Okay, so people are beginning to dial in. We've got Marco from NTT Data. We've just had...
Hello.
Hi,
Hello,
welcome. Welcome on board. We've got Klaus from PwC Germany. We've got Mark Giese. Gilles is here from Wipro, right?
Yes, absolutely. Hello.
Welcome. We have David Bainbridge. Which company are you with, David?
I'm with Ericsson.
Wonderful. Great to have
Yep.
you here. I think it might be first time we've had Ericsson on the call. Is that right, or have you dialed in before?
It's been in my calendar for a long time, but following the summer, I was in the kickoff meeting run by Oliver Fenn. So
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you here. Really good timing because, of course, the telco discussion is growing with OpenChain, and your input would be super appreciated. I think we're missing discussions with Ericsson and Nokia informally just to see what's happening in your market space and to ensure that our prep for being an ISO standard fits what you need to do too.
Okay.
We have a mystery caller with German dial-in. That is the number ending 1860. Just checking who that is.
That's me. It's Stefan Tannheiser from Fiducia GRD. Sorry for the confusion. Just got some problems dialing in here. For sharing the screen, it's my first time today to dial in, so I'd rather be a quiet listener today.
It is good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. We've got someone in from San Diego. I'm guessing this might be Jim Hutchinson or Dave Marr.
Good morning, Shane.
It's Jim.
Jim Hutchison. Welcome to San Diego. Yep.
Hi there. Good to have you here. It's quite exciting. A whole bunch of people today. We're going to get started roughly on time. We normally give it up to 5 minutes, but Mark Giese's going to do some overview for us, and we also want to get to spec, and Mark has to drop off at 30 minutes on the hour. So Philip's just joined from Nextbee. He'll be doing a presentation. Let's get started. So just so you know, these calls are recorded because our time zones mean that we can't get our Asian contingent on this call. It's 1 a.m. here in Japan, Korea, and it's midnight in China. So this call is recorded, and this will be shared with the Asian side of the OpenChain project and be available for your records forever. The agenda today is our roll call, which we have essentially gone through right now as we talk through who's here, and you're all recorded on the Uber conference is dialing in as well. Great to have you. Project update, then we're going to have our guest speakers and we move on to spec work team. As always, the purpose of the guest speakers is to give us insight into what's happening right now on projects that should be on our radar. One is related to supply chain monitoring with blockchain, and the others related to, of course, open source scanning for open source compliance. The project update is that we've been really busy, really busy. Third-party certification got a nice case study out. This case study was created in collaboration with Nicole from TÜV Süd, and it's a great opportunity to see how third-party certifiers work around things like the OpenChain project. That's an area we expect to grow over time. Essentially, there's 3 things you can do when it comes to OpenChain conformance. You can self-certify. You can have an independent compliance assessment where you collaborate with, let's say, a law firm or a consultancy to become OpenChain conformant. That's still self-certification, but you do have an independent compliance assessment which shows that a third party has looked at you. And then there's the formal third-party certification, which has a formal certification body actually providing you with a certificate in their ecosystem. In TUVSED's case, it is a certificate for TPS PBP 15001A, one of the TUVSED portfolio, which is based on OpenChain. Anyway, that's a good link to look at with third-party certification. We'll be digging into independent compliance assessment a lot more in the next month or two. That'll be another case study. The whole point is that the support infrastructure for OpenChain is growing rapidly, and that's based around essentially market demand, companies asking what's available if we want help. And we're trying to make sure that structure is in place globally. In fact, right now, we cover every major market space for the developed world and a lot of the developing world, barring France, where we're going to have to find a local partner. So hints and tips for that would be really cool. Onward, OpenChain interviews. We're going to be doing interviews at a pace of about one every 2 weeks to 1 month. These interviews will be showing the faces behind OpenChain globally. The idea here is to just give an insight into the personalities that drive the project to make sure that people understand this isn't some faceless activity, it's a global community. And if you're interested in being one of our interviewees, let me know. Be very glad to include you. Our pipeline has actually 5 interviewees from Japan queued up. Those are all female participants of the OpenChain project, and we'll be also adding interviewees from China, Korea, Taiwan, Germany, and the United States as soon as possible. UK, of course, too, before Brexit and complete collapse. If you're interested in being interviewed, just let me know, and I'd be delighted to include you in the interview schedule. OpenChain Spec 2.0 is in Korean. This is a nice step forward for us. We now have it in simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and Korean. We are currently lacking Japanese, but that is expected to come online relatively soon. So we're getting nice coverage in CJK, one of our key strategic areas for this year. The OpenChain work group in India held its first meeting, in fact, on Saturday, which is a great step forward for us. This is the first of 2 pivotal milestones for the project with regards work groups for this month. India's first, and China is on the 25th at Huawei in Shenzhen, with a whole bunch of companies coming together from silicon to software. By opening up our work groups in India and in China, we're basically putting in place the mechanism to address market spaces that cover 2.6 billion people. So we're very bullish about what this means for the project, especially as we go to become an ISO standard. Some of you are new on the call, so a heads up here if you're not aware. We are on fast track to become an ISO standard. Our target date of delivery is first half 2020. We actually expect to probably be an ISO standard around March 2020 if all the paperwork goes through okay. The purpose of this is to make sure it's easier to include OpenChain in procurement contracts. Alright, that's it for the project update. Those are some of the key things that have happened. Basically, a lot of internationalization and a lot more messaging about support infrastructure around OpenChain. All of this is to support, of course, the fact that we will be reaching broader than ever with the ISO release. Alright, I'm going to hand over to Mark because he's time limited today. Mark is going to give us a 10-minute intro to the S-Parts project. Mark, do you want to do screen share, or is this slide okay for you?
Let me do a screen share.
Okay, I'm going to pass over control to you right now. Okay, screen share should be with you. They've messed around with our interface, so it's it's on the bottom left at the moment. A few new people have joined. Jake McGowan is here. Indira Bhatt, David Marr. We're getting a screen share right now.
Okay. Can everybody see it?
Weirdly, I see a blank screen right now.
Everybody sees it. I said share, okay? You can go back up. You say stop sharing. Go back into Uber Conference and try something else here. So where do I find it? I found it on the left side. It said share your screen.
Yeah.
and I click on that, and it says screen 1. And can you see now? Can you see anything?
Oh, okay. Screen share is working for other people, it seems. Is that right?
No, I see a black screen.
Oh.
So right now it says your screen is sharing, and it says if I want to stop sharing, I can press this button here to stop sharing. Let me stop again.
Weirdly, Wendy at ARM can see it.
No, sorry, I said no, we can't. We can only see the blank.
Only the blank screen.
Okay. Let me go back. Let me get out of here. Activity. Okay, chat.
Yeah, Sammy, actually I can see it, or I could see it both times.
Oh,
Okay,
and
you can see it both times.
Indira confirmed it worked for her as well.
Okay.
Weird.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a visual presentation. So, right now, I'm sharing again, and it says, your screen is sharing. It says an Uber conference. And
This is so weird. Some people like Jeff can't see it, but other people can see it.
Yeah, I can see it again now.
Oh, Uber conference.
I'll make this quick.
All right.
Add in a little extra. I have only really 10 minutes, and it's actually could be an involved topic. There's going to be an assumption that you kind of know what a blockchain is, because I'm not going to spend any time talking about what blockchain is.
And just one note,
Yeah.
Mark, because half of our people don't have the screen, if there's any major cue, can you give it to us verbally as well?
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Yeah. So basically, this involves actually combining several different open source initiatives. It's the Hyperledger, SPDX, and OpenChain. And we created a new initiative that's under the Hyperledger project called SPART. So it stands for Software Parts Ledger. So if you're familiar with the blockchain, we're creating a ledger where you have a supply chain, and within the supply chain, all your different companies can register their software parts. And then you can actually gather up all this information across organizations, which is one of the biggest challenges today. I will point out that this is kind of, I would say, several years out kind of presentation, meaning I think we're all struggling just to get a lot of our suppliers to be OpenChain conforming and getting a basic program inside the company. But once you have a company with a program that's running, then we need a way to cross-function or cross-organization, gather up all this different information about the compliance artifacts that they're giving out. And even if a company doesn't have a 100% compliance program, they can publish whatever they have, and we can at least have a way of understanding what someone puts into the supply chain, even if it's not 100% OpenChain conforming. In this presentation, I'll describe the problem and the solution. The challenge here is, I often highlight the three different areas that we focus on in using this ledger, blockchain ledger. There's license compliance, which we're all familiar with, right? There's also, with open source, there's also security vulnerability concerns. And what's great about OpenChain is because we force our conforming people to create a bill of materials. We're not forced, but we validate that they have one. That's very helpful when you're dealing with open source and security vulnerability issues, because then you have that bill of materials and you can see in case there's a vulnerability, then you can go look inside it. And then the other area we're also concerned for trying to support is the safety certification world. And this is also growing in the open source world. I've seen a number of Linux Foundation projects trying to deal with safety certification. But again, for this presentation, we're just going to do it like the compliance part of the blockchain. What I'd like to highlight is when we as people that deal with license compliance, we're really delivering at the end of the day when we ship our software several artifacts, right? And that's where we start. We start where the compliance program ends, and they put them into the supply chain or offer it up to the customer. And we're expecting them to give out a list of open source, potentially, a set of required source code, required notices, and SPDX data if that's a request. I'm going to go past these other two. But what's common across whether we're doing license compliance again and for security vulnerability and safety certification is the fact that we have a list of open source software, and that's the core of the OpenChain initiative, or the program of anybody who's OpenChain conforming. If you can see the screen here, I'm basically highlighting the fact that we're just going to be focused on the last part of this workflow, where we have the software part is it's a library, an application, the entire container or Linux runtime, and along with that always accompanies a collection of information, right, SBS data, notices, and source code. What we can do is we can flag that data as being OpenChain conforming, and we can store that onto the blockchain ledger and track that through the supply chain. Okay, so if anybody, there's one terminology that's often used when you talk about blockchains and supply chains, this notion of chain of custody. And what I have is an image here where I talk about, in the most basic sense, when you have manufacturing, you start at the forest level, maybe gather raw materials, wood or whatever, and you have a mill, and you might have a factory, and then a redistribute, and then and the basic concept of that I'm trying to define here is the chain of custody, the notion that throughout this process or workflow through the supply chain, you have many different organizations touching or contributing to the development of a product. So the chain of custody is really knowing the path it's following and all those who participate in that process. So with open source, I like to highlight the fact that there's also a chain of custody, and that's what we're trying to track here with the ledger. That every let's say embedded device starts out with a piece of hardware and some software, often a set of open source. And then as it goes through the supply chain, the next vendor might offer up an operating system along with, in collecting up those previous drivers. And then it progresses through the supply chain again. And on a whole application. What's happening as it's going through each vendor, the amount of open source is growing, and that we want to be able to track that through the whole process. When the product is finally delivered, all the open source that is involved through all the different suppliers through that chain of custody is gathered up, offered up to the user. So from the sense of the compliance world, we basically identify this notion of a compliance envelope, which is really the set of things that output out of your compliance program. This envelope is what you gather for all yours, and as you go through each one of these participants in the supply chain, this envelope is growing, and that's what's keeping track of the open source as well as any legal notices and other things like SPDX data. Again, I'm sorry for those who can't see it, but I'm trying to show this chain of custody, and as it moves through the supply chain, this collection of information grows because each supplier is adding to that. And with the basic understanding is every single device that ever ships in the world is required to deliver that to the end user, the compliance envelope. That's what this current slide represents. I was going to show an example of the chain of custody for a particular video camera here. And again, what we're showing is that at the first interaction between two companies, we have a set of drivers being delivered as well as a set of artifacts. And then the next level going up, on top of that, and they're adding particular drivers, they're adding their deliverable, and their compliance process is bigger because they're adding all the things that come before them by the other suppliers. The final step is very again, showing that when you finally ship the video camera, that you've gone through and you've gathered up all this data, and you're able to ultimately deliver it to the end users, right? And the ultimate goal here is the ability. How can we trust each of the suppliers? How can we have insight into the data they provided in case something goes wrong, right? And then that's where chain of custody is really important, right? And so accountability is the first thing we're focused on using a ledger, blockchain ledger. The second thing is access. How can we give people access to all that data, all those different suppliers and their compliance artifacts? How can we query and get that data back? And that's the key here. So the solution is, God, this is going to be hard to show or talk through with other, basically I was going to try to talk about what exactly the ledger is in terms of the basic characteristics. So what it does is it tracks. The ledger is like think of it as a spreadsheet or, and it tracks some kind of thing, and then there's going to be some notion of transactions on those things. So if you have a bank account or Bitcoin, every time someone transfers, money from one person to another in the Bitcoin world, or from your bank account every time you get a debit or credit, you're getting a transaction performed, and the ledger's keeping track of those transactions. Very important to track. So not only did the transaction happen, but when did it exactly happen? And ultimately, you can actually use a lot of guarantees on this. For example, you want to know in your bank account what was your balance on, say, first, and you have to do taxes, there's some sort of truth. And ultimately, at the end of that, you're going to have because of all those elements are in place. And so what I try to highlight is that this is actually a common situation throughout our lives. And I don't want to, because others can't see this, I was trying to talk about FedEx and package tracking. That's a ledger too. You're dealing with things, packages, transactions. Every time it moves from one location to another, transactions performed. Then you have time. Where is it at this point in time? And then the truth is, tell me now where it is. How can I trust that that is exactly where it is? But the other analogy I like to draw is Git. Okay, Git is a ledger. Okay, it's very analogous to how a blockchain ledger works. And in this diagram, I'm showing you that what Git is tracking is all these different transactions about changes to code or maybe a document and the commits that are made over time. And again, we're dealing with things which are source code. The transaction is the action modification of the source code. The time is, at this point in time, this was the state of that software. And then there's some notion of truth about the software that we know that at this time this person made modifications. We knew that was a bug. So again, if you can see this, that this workflow is really we do even as software developers. So what we want to do is look at software as parts, just like we do in the automotive industry. What we tend to do is our parts can be very simple, like source files, or they can be an entire library, an application, a container, or a Linux runtime. There are different granularities, but each of those can be represented in the supply chain. It doesn't have to be any one of those. And that's really important, just like we have a typical, in your hardware supply, we have all kinds of screws, or you might have more complicated, in this case, caliper. And ultimately, that's the thing we want to track on the ledger. It's a software part. And we're trying to use a slightly different vocabulary to make people think slightly differently about these things. They're well-defined things, they're well-defined parts. And so I'm going to now show you how we apply this notion of this kind of a Git kind of tracking, if you want to call it, through the supply chain. So here's what I'm putting up here is a ledger, and basically, when you have someone contribute something to the supply chain, in this case, we have some drivers being produced, right, for legal notices, and that's into ledger first transaction, just like we talked about the bank account having debits and credits. Every time they perform a transaction, the two items are right are showing block. I'm telling you that there's precise information about when it happened, and the lock is not be altered or modified without knowing. Or if I alter the record, you would have give it a check corrupted.
Hey Mark, your audio is really fading out. I think your connection might be a bit slow. Maybe stop the screen share.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Better?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I'm going to put this up to my ear. Okay. So what we have here is the first row. Someone offers up a drivers to, say, the initial hardware. And then the next transaction is someone comes along and says, I'm going to build this runtime, this Linux runtime. And they're going to include those drivers into their runtime. And then they're going to specify that they added their compliance artifacts onto the ledger. And we're going to know that next participant in the supply chain has recorded the time, right, as well as when that transaction happened. And then we're moving along. Now, you'll notice that I highlighted here, I'm going back and forth, there's a little ribbon here. That means that envelope was OpenChain conforming. Okay, so when we have that next transaction performed on the blockchain, actually I didn't have the graphic here, but this one over here designates that it's OpenChain conforming, and that should have been over here, but the slide doesn't have it at the moment. So basically, what's happening here is that the next action is to put the compliance artifacts on the ledger. And then as we go and see, you can't alter the ledger, as we talked a little earlier. What you can do, you can perform a transaction that said this previous piece of, or this particular artifact, such as the SPX data here, was updated, or the legal notice was updated. And the key here is that you can go back in time and say, well, at one point in time it was this, and then legal notices was this document, but then a later point in time you can see it was updated. And that's helpful to know. Again, you never delete something and replace it, but you just update it. And similarly, someone can do that for code as well. And then again, the red ribbon there is put on just to say that we're designating this as OpenChain conforming, and that would be tracked on the ledger, so someone would know some of these compliance artifacts by this one vendor was OpenChain conforming, but this other set wasn't. And that would give you a lot more insight onto how much you can trust the entire set of data when you finally get it delivered at the end of the supply chain. Okay. I'll just go past the slide. Hold on. All right. So that was the gist. Again, this is just a 10-minute presentation of I think a more complicated topic of dealing with the ledger. But ultimately, what we're showing here is the main point to take away from is right now we're all focused on trying to make sure an individual supplier is conforming. What this is trying to do is say, let's coordinate between the different organizations as they put their stuff into the supply chain. We can track through, and if I am dealing with several suppliers and I deliver my stuff, then everybody who came before me, you can have insight into the suppliers that I depended on. Okay, that's the gist. And we're basically trying to deliver this as an open source free ledger for anybody to use. We are kind of experimenting with some of our larger customers on how to use this. I still think it's a little early for mainstream, but we have one company that's actually using it inside their company because they have several different business units, and they're trying to use each business unit as an internal supplier and trying to track internally as well. The code is noted here. It's available under the Apache 2.0. It's a sub-project under the Hyperledger. And as I mentioned a little earlier, it is possible to use this internally to track all your compliance artifacts as well as your certification data and safety data. As I was trying to highlight, one of the most important things here was accountability, meaning you can go back and find out who delivered what. So if there was a problem, someone was missing source code, you can go back and find out which supplier was the one who didn't deliver the source code. And then also, the other point we're trying to talk about is access. So now that someone can actually go in, have like a QR code and query for that particular product and get back all that compliance data or the artifacts by a single query for a single product. So it's not just accountability, but it's also I can get access to that data very easily. And then finally, this is where we were talking about how you could also go back and see throughout the history and find out who was OpenChain conforming and who wasn't. Okay. As I mentioned, we were looking at applying this to other areas besides license compliance, such as security vulnerability and safety critical. And that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Can you email me the slides, and I'll try to sync them with the video for later.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
And so everyone, what I'll do is first of all, we'll distribute the slides, and I'll also take a little time to edit our video to make sure the slides are in sync, or roughly in sync with the audio. So we'll have that through. But in a nutshell, SParse is actually, a child of OpenChain. It's something that is initiated by Mark, and it's now part of Hyperledger. And the idea here is that it links the parts of the chain and provides an avenue for doing that.
Shane,
yeah.
Shane, I'm sorry, I don't know. You are very faint. I'm not quite sure whether it's a general problem with the Uber conference.
Okay, let me see if I can get better. How's this?
That's definitely better.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that, Sammy. Well, I was just saying to everyone that, this is essentially a child of OpenChain. That's an interesting approach to implementation, and I think it's important to have on our radar, even if various entities have no intention of using blockchain per se. But this is an example of how we thread the supply chain.
Yeah, think of it this way, is that OpenChain conformance gives you a trust with a particular vendor, and this is allowing you to sew together all the different vendors and get trust across your entire chain. So, and again, it is, kind of a little bit early stage. I don't anticipate a lot of people are going to be ready to use this, but I think in 3 years time frame, I think this might make more sense. Okay. With that, I'm going to actually have to move on, actually.
All right, Mark. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Sorry, guys. I have to go to another meeting unexpectedly. Thanks. Bye.
So that's interesting. It ties into some questions I had. I was in Germany last week. Yeah, I think it was last week, meeting some automotive companies, and one of the questions came up is, OpenChain is great, but how does it in practice apply to the whole supply chain? And I suspect that over time we'll see more of these initiatives to tie together the OpenChain conformance and to provide practical methodology for addressing quality open source compliance across your whole supply chain. Now, time's a bit short. I'm just going to pause here and see if anyone have any pressing questions at this juncture. All right, we're going to dive into another presentation. There's going to be Philip talking about scan code. So this is one of the hot topics lately. People have been talking about how do we ensure that open source tooling can be used for open source compliance. Philip's going to give us a brief intro on how scan code works. Philip, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to definitely compress you to 10 minutes, so I'll have to call time at 38 minutes past the hour, but it would be fantastic if you could begin your presentation and let us know the status of this scanning tool, because we've had a few presentations around tools like Fossology and other related tools, but we haven't had scan code yet.
Good. All right, so let me share my screen. I also posted in the chat the slide deck, so you can access it straight of the GitHub repo. It's a PDF.
Your screen is sharing perfectly for me.
And there you go. So you tell me whether you can see my screen or not.
Perfect.
But again, if you can't, it's available online too in the chat. So you can see it in the Uber conference.
No, it's all going fine, actually, Philippe.
Good. So, Scan Code Toolkit. So, it's a tool to scan for origin license. So, I'm sure it's a subject that's familiar to all of you. Why would you want to use it? First, it's easy and simple to install and run. It's essentially self-contained. It offers what we think are the very best accuracy in terms of license and copyright detection. Internally, it uses natural language processing techniques, but that's not really things you should care too much for. It does run on Linux, Mac, and Windows, which is a bit uncommon. Most of the tools in that space are fairly limited to running on Linux most of the time. And it also collects, beyond license and copyright, things from package manifest and the dependencies. And it's important because nowadays we see more and more software products that contain hundreds, if not thousands, of third-party package dependencies. Used mostly as these, so it's important to be able to collect all the information about these. There's a lot of volume. And it's a fairly modern code base. It's easy to understand and evolve. And these together make it fairly unique in the space. So it's easy to install to install and run. And to me, especially in the context of OpenChain, it's essential. It means it runs on your laptop. I got my mother to actually install and run it. And the light, the clock, the alarm clock still blinks on 00 on our VCR. So just to tell you that was a feat. So it means it's easy to install. That's really important. It doesn't need a server. It runs on your machine. It runs today. That means it can be used by anyone within your company in diverse development teams. It can also be used by your supply chain partners, be they vendors, customers, and they don't have to have any kind of complex infrastructure or complex knowledge to be able to install, run, and benefit from the tool. It's what we think is the best in class for license detection. I could go at great lengths explaining what are the different techniques for detecting licenses. But what we do is rather different. Because of the accuracy and the fact it's fairly easy to evolve, it evolves at a very fast pace and integrates a lot of new licenses at a brisk pace, which other tools are usually not able to do. It also is able to collect the full matched notice text, which means can be used, and we've already seen actually at least one other project taking advantage of that to automate the creation of attribution notice based on the actual notice text and copyrights found in the code base. And we are working right now on making a formal benchmark for accuracy, just so you don't have to take my word only for it. But the reality is that when you compare it to other open source tools and also several commercial tools, they often either misdetecting things or they misdetect, both of which require, you require much more work in terms of review after the fact. And it's been used by some organization that been looking for possibly the best tool in that space and settled on using Kenpo. Finally, it's also easy to integrate in your process because it's a command line tool with minimal dependencies. We don't yet provide any kind of formal integration with CI/CD type pipelines, but we have reports of several folks using it in Jenkins, for instance, or Travis or else. And it provides SPDX, JSON, and CSV output. I'm also the maintainer of some of the SPDX tools at the SPDX project, and one of the SPDX co-founders, just as a side notice. All right, so in terms of community, in that very narrow niche of tools that detects origin license code, I was looking this afternoon, and we are definitely one of the most popular tools in that space with a lot of stars and forks. But what we're more proud of is the number of contributors. I'm the maintainer, and I'm probably the biggest contributor there in terms of commits. But we have quite a few contributors. We have contributors that are lawyers that contribute new license text and notices that were not detected exactly correctly as it is. And the fact that a lawyer can contribute to the project just tells you how easy it is to get into it. And that's really important for the overall value that you can get and the long-term viability of the project itself. And we're now part of the new open source compliant automation tooling group as part of the OpenChain project itself. So definitely something you should have a look into. So, and that's pretty much it. If there's one takeaway, is it's a great tool. It's easy to install and run. It collects all the things you would need if you were to look at the code base. And really, if you think about OpenChain and your supply chain partners, whether they are big and small, that could be a tool that's easy to deploy and easy to provide data that you can exchange and share scans, be they JSON or SPDX, with very low friction. And there's one thing you should take away from this, that's it. And you wouldn't be in a bad company there either. Several projects are using it. The one I'm the most proud of is the Linux kernel, because there's been a huge amount of work done there to replace all the weird license notices that exist in the Linux kernel. There were over 700 different ways to say this file is under the GPL. Now we use SPDX license expressions and identifiers. and all the work done by the Linux maintainers, in particular Thomas Gleisner and Greg Koratman and Kate Stewart and others, has been done using scan code to help clarify and rationalize the kernel licensing. And so one issue, like every project, we don't have a huge amount of documentation. It's easy, so it's not too much of a problem, but we're also having today, this Monday, a tech writer that's working on us on our documentation for the next 3 months as part of the Google Seasons of Doc, which is a new program similar to the Summer of Code, but to help open source project have better documentation. So we expect to have vastly improved documentation over the next 3 months, and that will basically close that gap. And that's pretty much it. Here are the URLs you can look at too. And beyond that, there's some other companion tools and projects we're working on. Delta code is to compare 2 scans. It can be useful when you do a scan commit by commit to make sure you only compare the increment. About code is to generate attribution notice, eventually based on scan, but could be other inputs. Trace code is more for the world of embedded devices. It allows to track very finely what you put in a build, which exact files are linked together, or there are links statically, dynamically, that kind of stuff. And a new project that's also starting, was started as a Summer of Code project, but it received recently some interest from the NLNet Foundation in Holland and the European Union. It's vulnerable code where we're building a free and open vulnerability database for open source packages. So we can easily go beyond license, look up vulnerabilities in known vulnerabilities in code. And then the next step, we're releasing release candidates of the next version in the last few weeks and the next few weeks, and we're starting monthly community requirements planning for version 4. We're participating also in this open source compliance program, tooling and automation. So if you either use it or don't use it, but have things that you would like to see in terms of features, that's an open source project, and that's how we manage it. So you're really welcome to join and chime in. And again, you don't have to be technical there. Again, today we've received some reports from a lawyer, so it means it's really easy to look at.
Now
we're
gonna have to wrap up pretty quickly, so if we could just work through this slide.
I'm done. So that's it.
Brilliant. Now, before we just turn off the slide, in case anyone has joined and they're very new and they're thinking, why are they talking about tooling so much? This is a standard for open source compliance. We're at a pivot point as we go into global implementation. You know, we're looking at being an ISO standard in around 9 months. We've got a lot of companies putting OpenChain into practice, either announcing conformance or using it for internal improvement. And the most common question in our community right now is, okay, so how do we do it in practice? How do we automate it? How do we track across companies? And that's where S-parts and scan code come in. And I cut off Philip there because we're so low on time, but one thing on his slide, SPDX Lite support mentioned at the bottom. Japanese companies are in deployment, Toshiba, Hitachi, Fujitsu, with a variant of SPDX internally for quite a while. And what we're seeing is, as the global cooperation happens, we're seeing synchronization across projects, harmonization, and hopefully very soon reference implementations that we can have turnkey for all types of suppliers that might need automation. So this is all about pivoting into practical implementation of process points, and those process points taken together are what bring you to OpenChain conformance. Philip, thank you so much. That was brilliant. I'm going to share my screen to show the slides as we move on. Okay, so We've covered some of the interesting far ahead tooling with S-parts for whole supply chain monitoring and continuous improvement. You can see who's conformant when and why. We've had a quick look at scan code, which is one of the most advanced and performant open source scanning tools for open source compliance. And now we're going to pull back again and have a look at where the spec is. Okay, so a lot of people are moving into deployment of OpenChain. They're using OpenChain 2.0. And this version of OpenChain spec is going into the ISO process. We're doing a little bit of reformatting as per this slide, which should be shared with you now. And this reformatting is focused on essentially how do we make sure the spec is in the format that's expected for ISO, and how do we clear up any editing legacy items that we've seen. We had some discussion about making changes to the spec, improving it as we go into ISO, but the work team community had a general consensus that we shouldn't really make changes apart from any clarification that's utterly necessary. And the clarification that was discovered by the work team was that we had used software staff and program participants interchangeably. And it would make sense to just use the term program participants throughout the spec. This has no functional change to the spec. It's simply a matter of harmonizing essentially an editing holdover. We had software staff originally, we moved to program participants, yet at one point in the 2.0 spec it used the terms interchangeably, and we're just tidying that up. We do want your eyes on this though. The OpenChain spec in ISO, when it comes out next year, will be something that we will live with for many years. So we want your help to identify and improve any areas where you think there is an editing issue with the spec, a clarity issue that we could address without leading to a change in the specification requirements, so that companies that are version 2 conformant of OpenChain will be able to be ISO conformant with the version, as we're calling it, 2.1 spec, that is the ISO version. You can see here a link for the draft markup that shows you exactly what we're looking at changing. You can see information about the issues reported on GitHub. And I'll just pause here at this second. Does anyone have questions about the ISO spec at this juncture? Alright, I'm going to progress into some high-level notes from the governing board. The governing board has a subcommittee to review the ISO spec and make sure that it syncs again with what we expect, that it matches version 2.0, that it's consistent with all of the goals and intent that we have. This subcommittee is going to be meeting a few times in the next few months. At this juncture, there's no detailed information. We're still at the review process. It's another set of eyes on to make sure that everything is as we expect. The high-level note from the governing board is that, similar to the work team, there's consensus that we should try to ensure that we do not change the requirements of the spec 2.0. We can identify in this process items which we could change to improve the spec, but those should go into another version of the spec, not the first ISO version, unless we believe that they're functionally vital for the spec deployment. So short version, the high-level note from the governing board is in sync with the work team. We want eyes on. If there's any showstopper or area where the spec has an inconsistency between 2.0 and 2.1, we want to highlight it. If there's any point where the spec is broken, if there's a stopping issue where you think, actually, this would really hold us up as an ISO standard in practice, we do want that flagged. We want minimal changes. We don't want to change any particular item, but if we have to, of course we will. So that's it. We're on track. We'd like to have this stuff done relatively soon. Mark Giese had to drop off the call, but he is locking down the spec October 31st. And on October 31st, that's it. Editing has to be complete. So we would love if you could put eyes on before that. Any kind of questions or comments from people who've had eyes on the spec, or people who are considering doing it and want any hints and tips?
Shane, just a comment from me. I mean, I think we have quite a lot of new people on board, and it's fair to say that over the last couple of years, we really have done extensive number of reviews of the specification until now. So it is not surprising that the general consensus that the move between 2.0 to 2.1 that we should have minimal changes, because again, if you look historically, we have consistently made a reasonable amount of changes, and there has always been justification behind why those changes are required. So that people don't feel, well, we can't make any changes just because we're going through the ISO. I think it's important to highlight that there has been a number of changes over the last couple of years.
It's an excellent point, Sammy. Thank you so much for bringing it up. And yes, we've had over 150 contributors over a period of 4 years on the spec. So it's been through the ringer, from small companies to large multinationals across multiple sectors. So there might be areas where people have questions. Maybe the first thing to say is that where there's a question, our first assumption is there might be an answer. We just haven't recorded it properly somewhere. Maybe it's something that we assumed everyone already knew, because our conversations, of course, have gone on for a long period, and we want to address those too. We're going to improve our Q&A around the spec, and if necessary, of course, we could include various appendices that people could use for further clarification. What's important is that you help us see what needs to be done at this juncture. October 31st, we lock it down. Around March 2020, or a little bit after, we should be an ISO standard. Okay, the exciting thing here is we'll just pause again to see if anyone has some questions. And bear in mind, there's no questions that are silly around this. If you're new to this call, the whole purpose of these calls is to raise whatever we've got, address them, and ideally record and disseminate that to everyone else so everyone's up to speed. Our community is hundreds of companies across 3 continents, and everyone is syncing up, but this synchronization takes a while, and we need to tease out any lack of clarity and try to make sure we cross every border with greatest possible understanding. Alrighty. Any other business? We are, after having a call which introduced some of the tooling options on the horizon, we've had a quick look at where the spec is at. Are there any other items you'd like to discuss on this call at this juncture? Okay, if there are no other items, we're going to wrap up here at the 50-minute mark. We will be focusing on the spec, multiple calls going forward. What you can expect on the next call is that we'll be trying to raise some of the comments that have come in, and we'll explain why we will be addressing them now, or we'll be addressing them later, for instance in another version of the spec a few years down the line. So we'll be talking practical feedback. That'll be what we call our third Monday call. But because this call was pushed back to second Monday, third Monday call will be on the fourth Monday unless we have any objections. And with that, the floor is open. Do you have any other business? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of this. If you're new to OpenChain and feel a little bit confused, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll bring you up to speed on any area where you feel you need some support. And of course, everyone is at different stages in addressing OpenChain. We've had a few completely new people today. That's awesome. You will have noticed on our call that some people are very familiar with what we're doing. Some people are working directly on implementation around what we're doing. For instance, Philip at Nextbee with scan code. And some people, of course, it's their first call, and they're coming here to test the water of OpenChain. We're very inclusive. We're trying to have face-to-face meetings as often as possible. We'll be having meetings, for those of you who joined later than our first overview. We'll have meetings in China, Taiwan this month. We just had one in India. We'll be having meetings in Europe at Open Source Summit in October, automotive meeting and general OpenChain meeting. We will be having meetings in North America adjacent to large events. At every occasion, we're going to try and make sure that we can all network and we can synchronize our activities so we all end up prepared for OpenChain conformance, and we're sharing our notes for shortcuts to great compliance. Thank you very much for being on the call. I will talk with a lot of you on our next call, and I will try to take the slides and the audio from this call and make sure that everything is improved so that people can access this information long term, and our Asian stakeholders can do it too. Goodbye all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shane.
Bye. Bye everyone.